Hi, everyone. Welcome again. My name is Asan. I am a PhD student at Rutgers University at the School of Criminal Justice. I'm super excited to be here today with this fantastic panel. For folks that are funneling in, this moderated discussion is going to be about 45 minutes. We're going to go over some questions about PAR. We're going to talk to these folks about their work and their scholarship and their activism and how it centers on this issue. Please excuse the sound of motorbikes. The kids in the neighborhood are all outside. So sorry about that. But like I said, this is going to be about a 45-minute moderated discussion followed by a Q&A. Before we jump into the questions, I want to offer our panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves, to share a little bit about their backgrounds before we kind of jump in. I'm just going to go by order of the folks on the panel. So Dr. Fahlberg, if you could take us away. If I pronounce that incorrectly, please correct me.
No, you got it. You got it. Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to talk about PAR, which I'm very, very passionate about. And it's an honor to be with the other panelists here. I am an assistant professor of sociology at Tufts University. Just in terms of my PAR work, I look at activism in the context of neighborhoods governed by gangs and with a focus in Latin America. And I have used participatory action research in both my ethnographic work and also in other types of data collection, including some large-scale survey work in neighborhoods governed by gangs.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Dr. Payne, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Yasser Arafat Payne. I'm on faculty in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. I'm also have a joint appointment with Africana Studies, and a lot of my work is African-centered. I have a PhD in social personality psychology, but I am a street ethnographer, and I use street participatory action research methodology as a way to do my ethnography. So dating back to my dissertation, I've been training teams of guys that are either active, formerly incarcerated, particularly in Black communities, from New York all the way down to Delaware and beyond, to be honest with you, in schools, prisons, and communities. So I'll stop there, but in short, that's the kind of work that I do. We do mixed method studies, large survey samples, and a nice, robust qualitative dimension as well. But that's my work. Cool.
Thank you, Dr. Payne. Dr. Trejos Castillo, again, so sorry.
I said it properly, thank you. Hello, everybody, welcome. We're very, very excited to be here with you tonight. My name is Elizabeth Trejos Castillo. I'm a professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences at Texas Tech University. I've been here for about 15 years. And my work centers around minority youth and international youth on the issues related to vulnerability, risk, and internalizing and externalizing outcomes. But some of the things that I have used participatory action research more focus on, it has to do with the multi-system youth, the ones that are involved in juvenile justice at the same time in foster care, but other types of systems that sometimes we feel like they fall into those cracks. My research is mixed methods and mostly national, cross-national, and cross-cultural as well. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I do.
Thank you so much. And last but absolutely not least, Dr. Wilson.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you guys tonight. My name is Dr. Jonathan Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of the Fathership Foundation. Fathership Foundation is a community-based 501c3. And we use PAR research to develop our programs to address disparities and inequalities over time in urban communities that are marginalized and things of that nature. So we use our programs to address disparities that come from structural inequality over time.
Awesome, fantastic. So let's jump into it. My first question for you guys is if you could speak to your research trajectory. So meaning, considering the long histories of research behind you, have you always considered yourself to be a PAR scholar? And if not, or if so, how did you come into this research? And y'all can take this however you deem appropriate.
It's interesting you asked that question. It's a great question. My introduction to formal research was as a community participant, PAR member. And in Wilmington, Delaware, I was on a team where they went out into the community and recruited 15 people that were street identified. They were studying the correlation, the relationship between violence and structural inequality. And that was my first introduction to PAR, and I'm still doing it.
So my first introduction to PAR was with Dr. Jonathan Wilson, So, a lot of my work before Wilmington, Delaware, as a doctoral student began in Harlem, and I did my dissertation cut between Harlem and Paterson, New Jersey. There's a highway called Route 4 that actually connects both communities. But in any event, I would say my trajectory probably began though much earlier than that. I began doing a lot of outreach work, all kinds of community organizing with guys who were active in the streets, probably starting around the age of like 19, 20 years old. Even at that time, I was doing, what we were calling then gang intervention, but really organizing guys, training them, right, to, particularly around at that time, Black American history and some other things. But it became really popular, in New York City. But that was my training grounds. But it wasn't until I started working on a PhD and I ran into someone by the name of Michelle Fine, who's a big name in PAR, that I actually had training, right, that I was able to bring data analysis to this outreach effort that we were doing in these street communities. I really come from a community organizing background. A lot of folk, will say certain politicians like Barack Obama, and I don't know what everyone's politics are, but I was a real community organizer. I was taking it seriously. I fell in love with the art or the craft of really doing good, high quality community work. And I was working with a lawyer at the time. So by the time I got the chance to work on a PhD, the lawyer had convinced me it would be a great idea for me to get a PhD to really bring some gravitas to the community organizing work that we were doing in places like New York. But one last word, let me just say this. I didn't realize how much my training in PAR, I took it for granted, how much it would benefit me moving forward, just knowing how to connect the dots, cross my T's, dot my I's, particularly as a faculty member. A lot of the work that I did with Dr. Wilson was based off of the stuff that I was doing in New York, but it was my training under Michelle Fine that really provided me a solid example of how to do it as an academic, right? Particularly in the R1 department and all, and they really want the pubs, but we really embarked on a community-based project around violence. All right, I'll stop there, I promise.
I'm happy to follow because in some ways my experience mirrored those of Dr. Payne, and in other ways not. I also have been really involved in social justice work, less as an activist and more doing community advocacy work. So I worked with immigrant survivors of domestic and sexual assault. I grew up in Brazil, and so I speak Spanish and Portuguese and really gravitated towards work with that community. And then eventually decided to go into academia because I wanted to understand why society claims to be against domestic violence and then it's all over the place, and why society says it's inclusive and has barrier after barrier after barrier for immigrants and other survivors of all sorts of violence to actually get the resources they need. And went into sociology and immediately realized that academia reproduces all of the things we claim to care about. Unfortunately, I did not have much PAR training. I had a wonderful department that was extremely supportive. I did take like a summer course, which was on CBPR and environmental justice in the United States. But the work I do is an informal neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. There aren't formal organizations that my university could partner with. The structures just are not the same as some of the CBPR work that gets done in the United States and in the public health arena. And I just faced one dilemma after another in trying to figure out how to make my research participatory, how to pay people when there were no funding structures. And I know we'll get to the challenges in a minute, how to include their voices when I had to publish things in English, how to even get a job in academia, et cetera. So everything for me was just trial and error, trial and error, trial and error. And eventually I met other people who do PAR but it was really a commitment to saying we can't do academia and not do it in a socially conscious way that actually includes participants. And then just trudging forward saying, I'm going to figure this out somehow.
Well, that's a great segue to my experience, which I think is kind of similar to yours. I'm originally from Costa Rica, and I was a student in psychology and heavily trained in the area of social applications. And we do a lot of like 100 to 300 hours of service in the communities before we can actually get our undergraduate degrees. That's how heavily community oriented it is. And so I discovered this by doing it. I had no idea that this had a name. And then I ended up living in Honduras for 5 years, working as a clinician in a hospital as well. And then at some point I realized that my heart is in the community working on prevention. And how can I do prevention, when you are behind a desk all the time? So I think in my way, it was just a discovering that by doing this, it was a personal call. And when I came to the States and started getting trained in academia and ended up working here at Tech and in the university, I felt like I needed to take everything outside of my office to do prevention in the community. So it's been a really awakening process in my case, in working with different communities and also in international. I have also done some work in Brazil and India and in Honduras and Costa Rica. And it's exactly that understanding in context, the development of the youth. And in particular, in my case, has to do with this, the justice piece of it, being able to elevate the voices, being able to show that developmentally, adolescents, and I speak about adolescents because that's what I eat and breathe every day, right? But adolescents in general, developmentally, they go through similar stages and similar challenges. They have the same strengths and the same possibilities, but within the context, there's so many differences that we can see. So it's so interesting to be able to work with the community, get the knowledge. I always think that I learn more from the community that they probably learn from me. And it's just that constructivist approach, working with them all the time, that has really provided me with the tools. I'm not trained directly on PAR. I have just trained myself or learned by doing, but it has been a tremendous experience and being able to discover this by doing it.
Incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I understand that there are nuances to the ways in which scholars will operationalize and conceptualize PAR in their research. So if y'all could share the definition process you've relied on during your own work, for the sake of academic publishing, how do you operationalize PAR?
I believe that you got to stick. I try to stick to the most, I guess, beneficial aspect of components of PAR, and that is that you include the community has to be involved. I think when you're doing work, especially in the context of peace work or examining violence, in my case, extreme cultural violence and high rates of direct violence, you're inevitably going to come into contact with populations and groups that are somehow directly impacted or indirectly impacted by the violence. And one thing that PAR does, how I conceptualize it, is that it recognizes that the community and the people that in the group that you're studying have brilliant insights. People that have experienced violence, in my case, have brilliant insights as to the nature of violence, origin of violence, the ecology of violence in their communities, and also great ways to put together solutions to address the violence. And in doing so, what happens is that it brings an empowerment aspect to the community, because the community gets to identify what is important, when it's important, what we're going to get at, how we're going to get at, who do we need at the table, and most importantly, at the end, after we collect all this data, what are we going to do with it, as opposed to in more traditional ways, formal research, is that in my community, that information comes from a different space and it takes longer. Whereas in the community, in PAR research, the effect is while you're conducting the study in the space where you're conducting the study at. And it gives like an immediate, you're able to simultaneously do change work, healing work, and the research at the same time. So that's kind of like how I conceptualize PAR work.
Yeah, so there are dozens and dozens, right? So in the literature, there are dozens of participatory iterations, right? And I often say when I do my PAR trainings, PAR is population focused and it's topic focused, right? So that often drives the kind of PAR you do, and it drives the kind of literature that you look at, right? So my PAR literature is PAR literature that works with folk who are street identified, right? And around particular topics that Dr. Wilson and I are studying, vis-a-vis violence, right? Now, I think that's beautiful, that it's beautiful. And then there are also limitations, the fact that the PAR literature is gigantic. A number of different traditions, right? A number of PAR iterations by discipline, right? It's been around for a long time, and folk are using the same language, but they're definitely doing different things, right? So for us, right, we coined a term or an iteration of PAR called street PAR. We only want to work with folk who are in the streets, active, formally active, right? And because for us, street PAR is a socio-political project, right? This is about fighting, and our new weapon now is data, right? This is about organizing a group that has been ignored, particularly street identified Black men, right? They have, right? That's one group that's been excluded from just about every major aspect of life, right? Not to say that there aren't other groups experiencing certain things, right? But that's the group we want to work with. We always say, send us your shooters. We're going to send you back the kings and queens that they already were. Send me the folk that are the most difficult to work with, right? Because they're going to come to our program and we're going to train them. And right. And so we have a very aggressive definition of PAR, street PAR, right? So for our iteration of PAR, right? Our street PAR associates have to be involved with development of theory, methodological design, data analysis, co-authorship. They also have to co-present at conferences and the like. They are to be paid for their time, just like the graduate and undergraduate students or research assistants, right? And we are to engage in a real or robust action agenda, right? Which needs to be done throughout the duration of the project, not like one or two activities at the end. And Dr. Wilson and I have found a lot of success in Wilmington, Delaware, which is a small city and a small state, but we've been able to really organize and galvanize inside these communities. Hundreds of folk write us letters to train in our program from prisons and the like, right? So the idea is for them to come train with us, give them reading, writing, data analysis skill sets, transition them with those skill sets into upward mobility, right? Schooling opportunities, college, right? In the case of Dr. Wilson, he got his doctorate, right? And or of high quality employment. And we've had great success doing that. And we take action very seriously. You know, non-traditional forms of action to more formal kinds of action like policy reform.
So I can go next, and I really appreciate this question because that's exactly what happens. You know, in practice, I think our own passions get mixed with what we do and the tools that we use and how we approach this. So my perspective comes from the constructivist perspective, in which I like to construct knowledge and deconstruct knowledge with the community. It has a strong advocacy piece, definitely, because one of the missions with the population that I work, particularly the youth that are involved across multiple systems, and they remain invisible for many different reasons, right? I mean, related to race, to ethnicity, related to poverty, related to different vulnerabilities. So the advocacy piece is extremely important to be able to empower, to be able to use the tools, also to be able to construct and deconstruct the knowledge with them. they are the experts in what they're doing and what they're knowing, and we are able to use that to transform, or to identify best practices. So the way I see it is as a bridge in which I can connect research with practice, and I'm very heavily concentrated on the practice part. I think I kind of joke with my colleagues. I say we are data hoarders. In research, we are knowledge hoarders. We just accumulate all these huge amounts of knowledge and a huge amounts of data. And often we only speak to ourselves. We only read each other. But what happens in the practice part? So, like I said, my approach is mostly constructing with them and being able to find ways to utilize that knowledge and that data in ways that they can use, but also being able to build capacities with them and get trained. I like to involve students as well. We have discovered that by putting them in the right place with the right people, then there's a lot of these passion sparks, and then they realize that there's all these different type of applications that they had no idea it existed, that this is a real thing. Like when I started in academia a long time ago, the whole idea about outreach and engagement in universities was rather new. And we were moving from this model of extension into only research kind of thing. And now we're going back, which is exciting times for us to be able to be working on PAR and doing these collaborations.
I mean, I agree with everything that was said. For me, PAR is, it almost is spelled out, right? Meaningful participation, meaningful co-production of knowledge, and meaningful action. What I might add, I think what people have said is similar to what I was going to say. Is I've thought a lot, because I also work with communities that are incredibly affected by direct, physical forms of violence, political violence, state-based violence, structural violence. And I think of PAR as addressing epistemic violence, which is writing about populations, often populations of color, that have suffered multiple forms of violence, as if they are not knowledge producers, and they become subjects of knowledge that's produced in the ivory tower and never get a say over what stories they want told and what narratives need to be out there. When I first started my research in a neighborhood called City of God, which many of you may have heard of from the movie, the first question I asked was, what stories do you want me to tell? What stories do you want the world to know? And everybody said the same thing in one way or another, is we want people to talk about the good things, because everybody comes here and writes about violence, and we wish somebody would write about the good things that we do, because most of the day, most people are spending time doing wonderful things for each other, for society. And then, so I said, okay, let me embark on this project. But then it has become a matter of how do we even develop those narratives, and how do we do that meaningfully in cooperation with people? And Victor Rios writes about this concept of the white gaze, which is that anybody in academia, which is so heavily still dominated by the white perspective, ends up writing to a primarily white audience, and therefore has to cater to, these white discourses, and often they're very bureaucratic, and they have this particular idea of what good data looks like and what good theory looks like. And to me, PAR, especially as a white woman working in communities of color, that so much of my own work has to be to put my voice second, and to say, how can I use my social location to actually bring the voices that have been excluded into these conversations. And I completely agree with co-authorship, with creating opportunities for leadership, and for me to take a back row, creating opportunities for people to actually become formal academics if they so choose, and to also use whatever skills I do have in terms of research methods to push forward the agendas of local communities, and to say, how can we use data to actually advocate for the issues that this community finds important.
And if I may just piggyback really quickly off of Dr. Fahlberg's, point and perspective, so I definitely think PAR, inherently is designed to respond to epistemic violence. I know Street PAR we speak about, and I'm now writing about responding to Wade Noble's theory of scientific colonialism, right? and or you can look at the work, of critical race theorists, definitely Derek Bell, its founder, making a similar argument, and or that literature, CRT, making a similar argument, right? But the point I want to raise is yes, we end up writing in ways that really speak to the ivory tower, and we end up writing in ways that are really not accessible, right, to the populations or communities that we work with. But I just want to underscore the point that, but that is by design. That's what these theories teach us, right? That the academy is going to privilege a certain kind of knowledge and or incentivize a certain kind of knowledge, right? It's also going to incentivize the colonization, right, of certain perspectives or indigenous knowledges as well, right? So I just think PAR is also responding to the fact that it's not as easy, right? That our information, that these communities' information are being colonized in such a way to oppress these communities, right? So, and when you think about it from that perspective, it's like, wow, and that's so it's not as easy, right, as just simply telling people share their voice, or it's not as necessarily simple as saying, well, we need to do X, Y, and Z, right? When you have a multi-billion-dollar, industry that's invested, right, in the way that it is, right? So the greatest lesson that I actually learned, my father kept trying to teach me, right, my whole life, right, because he knew I was a little naive to things. But the greatest lesson that I learned, particularly becoming a professor, right, was that I didn't realize that at the end of the day, they didn't really want us going out into communities to really organize and mobilize and change anything, not in any real substantive way, right? And culture is rarely spoken, it's done, it's practiced for the most part, right? But even our culture within the academy, right? You kind of have to look around and look at the cultural tea leaves to kind of figure things out. So, right, nobody was actually saying anything. That's my point, right? No, well, you're doing a great job out there, but we don't, right? And then that's a hard lesson for somebody that's really, invested in the community and activism and all these other words that we use, right? When you get to the place where all the good people, right, eventually let you know, nah, that's not what it's about here. Then what do you do with your PAR program, right? And it's really getting in that place in an honest way that you can begin to create or develop a research program that can actually sustain, right, the heavy winds of the academy. But you got to be honest about what is going on right now. Right? And one of the best ways to oppress any community is by stealing and colonizing their knowledge, right? Forcing them to speak another tongue and think another perspective. That colonizing the mind, the body will soon follow, right? But it's not until we have this honest, cold conversation that we can really begin to explore and identify ways to do PAR in the academy, so cool. All right.
Just to piggyback on what Dr. Payne said, in street PAR, part of the trainings and coming up under Dr. Payne, we learned that with the community being on at every part of the research process, and even in the publishing process, we have an opportunity as a community to reframe the narrative, to reframe the language, right, to change the tone and change how these conversations are being had about violence, cultural violence, structural violence, inequality in our towns, communities, states, and so forth.
Absolutely.
So it gives the community a voice as well.
Yes,
If I could just jump in on that, I mean, I think everything that was said is exactly on point. And just, I know we're going to talk about challenges in a minute, but we see even with academia, this attempt to minimize and devalue PAR. When I applied for tenure track positions, I was told almost by every single mentor, don't mention you do PAR because you will not get a job. And then even today, people call PAR a method. Like some are ethnographers and some are, do mixed methods and some do PAR. And I'm like, no, PAR is an approach you take to no matter what method you do, right? But there is, I think, an attempt to categorize and then sort of push it to the side, because when you do meaningful PAR, it requires that all of the structures that currently exist get rewritten. The way that we decide who gets to qualify as a research assistant to then get paid to be on a project. If you don't have an institutional role? Can you be a co-author? I mean, there are so many bureaucratic structures that exclude people who, you know, don't fit a very narrow criteria. And the other, I think, important piece of this is that there are also inequalities within academia. And so the people who choose to do PAR often are people of color. You know, and then if you're not a tenured faculty, you can't get away with, you know, doing, not publishing, quote, rigorous academic scholarship. So there are so many ways in which this colonial project, as Dr. Payne put it really well, continue to be reproduced, even when there are there's increasing support for doing PAR.
That was incredibly insightful. My own research focuses on environmental crime at the macro level, and I've been kind of deep diving a lot into colonial works and trying to understand like how to do this work in a way that is not just like recreating the colonial structures that we exist in. So this is, for me, this has been incredible. My brain's just all over the place right now, but let's move on to the next question. And y'all have touched on it a little bit, but I would like you to spend some time discussing it. Could you speak to some of the issues you faced kind of conducting PAR, whether they were due to, you know, pragmatic limitations of working with certain communities, or the bounds placed on you by academia, by grants, by research institutions, or the places that you were conducting your research in?
I would like to start with that one and follow up on some of the ideas that were already discussed. When I started doing this, I'm telling you, it's 25, 30 years down the road, and I'm not that old, but you know, anyways, I had started young and just by doing it. But one of the things that I encountered was the resistance of academia to believe that this is a rigorous method, that this is something not even about the acceptance of it, is the importance, you know, the significance of actually doing this. We in academia, I always feel like we are very privileged because we hold this status of knowledge, but we are not, we have a hard time being able to facilitate this and put it in the communities, and even bringing the community to work with us, or taking the approach that we are community. That's always when I think about this, when I go work with the community. I am not Dr. Trejos, I am just Elizabeth, that's it. I wear jeans, a t-shirt, you know, ponytail, that's it I get, and start working with them. And sometimes they realize that I am associated with the university, and they're like, oh my God. So the attitude sometimes changes, but I really like for them to see me as a community member, because before, you know, before my work at the university, this is more important. I am active participant in what we're doing, and this is for everybody, particularly since I work in prevention, and I cannot do prevention from the office. I cannot do any of these things if I am not being with them working on that. So the resistance from academia has been really hard. I mean, at some point I was told when I was going through the tenure process, stop going to the community and published. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, one thing is more important than other. You know, I'm following my heart. You hire me because you knew I was doing this. So don't, you know, give me that discourse right now. But over the years, I have learned to navigate these two worlds and being able to merge them in a way that we have to be strong about our voice in academia and make it valid, but also being able to bring the value of the community back into the academia. I mean, at the end of the day, we do this because we are trying to advance programs and services and policies for our community. And this is going to be benefit for our families, for our children, even for our own very close relatives. So that is very important in my case. Working with communities, one of the main things was trust. You know, you move to a new place, they don't know who you are. And then you go there, you don't want to say that you're associated with the university in the first place, because then they feel like you're there as an observer, or that you're there just to use them to generate knowledge or publications or whatever it is that you do. So building that trust has been extremely humbling and very, very important. And I have had my own share of, you know, situations in which I just, you know, awkward situations in which I just had to basically stay on the side and just observe many different things. But that trust is incredible, because once you build that with them and they believe that you are with them, that you're working with them, not that you're working for them, you're working with them, which I think is even more important. You're part of them, you care for the same things, you fight for the same things, and then being able to elevate the voices. But being able to help them elevate their own voices, which I always tell them, I don't want to represent you. I want you to represent yourselves. I'm here to use my voice, but I want you to use your voice. So that trust and takes long ways. And I'm at a point right now after 15 years here in Lubbock that people just call me and then refer me to other people, and I just get calls in the office on my phone call, my personal phone, about issues that have to do with families, with prevention, connecting with services, have nothing to do with academia sometimes, but it has to do with building and trust and being able to be an active part of the community. So those are kind of my 5 cents on the struggles.
So I think of the challenges of PAR as maybe one useful way. I mean, they're infinite. The list of challenges just would take up, entire pages. But I think it might be useful to think of them as like external and internal challenges. So externally, we've sort of touched on some of them in terms of finding funding, all of the bureaucracy of academia. There are, very obvious, especially in my case, differences in terms of where we are in terms of social location, right? I never pretended that I never acted like I was part of the community, because I was raised in Rio, but not in that community. I'm white, I'm American, right? So I have many privileges that people in the community I work with don't have. And so those are, no matter how hard I try to create partnerships and to listen, at the end of the day, I still get to come back to the United States and have good health care. And my kid I don't have to worry about him getting shot on his way to school, right? And so there are some inequalities that I, as an individual, cannot overcome. And so the question is, how do I do the best I can with what I have, who I am, and the community that I'm working with. But there are also some internal constraints, which is that members of the community disagree, right? There are also all sorts of differences within the community that I work with. And there are power inequities within the community I work with. There are racial inequities, there are class inequities. And I think that sometimes there's this romanticization of PAR as if there's, quote, the scholar and, quote, the community. And it's actually much messier than that. And so what do you do when you have political cleavages within the community, right? What do you do when some people actually have some training there's some members of the community I work with who've taken some years of college courses. And so for them, being part of a research community is a much more seamless experience than people who didn't finish primary school. And so some of the challenges of PAR are also, what does it mean to even do participatory research when the community itself is not always on the same page? And how do you ultimately decide which of those voices get heard and which ones don't, right? You can't write a manuscript where every single person is a co-author. So who do you decide who gets to be a co-author, right? And then what happens when there's friction between people within the community, and then people want to leave the group or the team, right? And then when you've got a neighborhood governed by gangs, you have to be extremely careful about who you let in, and is it going to put people in jeopardy if you're very public about what you do? How do you collect data where some people may not want data to be collected? And so in practice, it's very, very messy. And I completely agree that developing trust and relationships is absolutely foundational. And I've been working with this one neighborhood now for 8 years. And I think it took 4 years for people to start feeling like maybe she really is, committed to this PAR thing she says she's going to do. But it just takes a really long time. And I think a lot of commitment and a lot of proving, okay, I am going to, do whatever I can to promote these principles, however imperfect.
Yeah, let me just jump in there real quick and say, definitely I piggyback off of Dr. Paulberg's argument. PAR is hard, right? It's oftentimes romanticized. And it's hard work. I think the biggest challenge for me is finding balance. I've done a lot of PAR projects, upwards of probably 15 PAR projects going back to being a doctoral student. I have a lot of experience with it, right? And finding balance. I haven't found anything more infectious inside an actual neighborhood than PAR, because I'm coming from a community organizing background. I'm actually using or wanting to learn, right, PAR, so that it can enhance my community organizing capacity. That's really my motivation, right? And you know, just like the stories, you know, I think some of the most aggressive forms of PAR are actually done in Central and South America, as well as New Zealand, the Tongan Islands, and in Australia, a region of the world, right? In the West, PAR is pretty tame, keep that in mind. Also in other places like China, Russia, Africa, Europe. Europe can have some streaks of radicalism, right? But in any event, I think here it's pretty tame. It's definitely inside the academy. You have to be really smart about the cultural underpinnings of the academy and how to move, you know, data or your argument, right? So with that in mind, this is a way that we kind of thought about it. Again, for us, Street PAR is a socio-political project, right? When we do trainings, right, like with Dr. Wilson, that training was 3 months, 2 months, and then a month review. And we're doing quant qual, you know, I'm teaching a lot of the same material. We're reading some of the same stuff that I teach in actual class at the University of Delaware. We do not water the process down, right? Because they really do got to get into college if that's what they want, or they really have to move on and transition. They got to walk away with real skills. Right. The other way that we organize it is this. It's 1 project, 2 project, 3 project, 4. Grow the PAR family within the same location, not one-off projects. Right. So at this point, I think we are on our 4th, 5th project now, because there's another faculty member who's joined the family. We went from 15 to trained probably somewhere between 60 to 70 folk now, right? And including all the students, everybody else, right? We got 150 or so people. Right, we now have a center for structural. So what we did is exponentially grow across projects inside the same community or city, right? Because it's a socio-political project. We're training them to be research activists, right? And part of the activism, yes, we're doing marches, yes, we're doing policy reform, we're working with politicians. PAR is a big deal in Delaware. I mean, the whole state too, right? And you know, and we began our work back in 2009, 2010, right? But the whole goal was to really organize ourselves in one space to fight back with our data. Now, once we started doing that, everything began to fall in place. Folks started getting jobs, folks started getting into schools, right? We started rocking and rolling, grant money started to come in. We working closely with politicians for good or for bad, right? Getting traditional grants, working closely with the hospital system, right? We really set up a nice situation while fighting back. Right now, one of the ways I wanted to leverage PAR, particularly through university, was particularly if you had an R1, there are lots of R01 grants. If you're at an R1, there are lots of R01 grants, right? Studying poor Black and brown people is a multi-billion-dollar market for the academy alone. So as a doctoral student, I learned then, right? But I definitely learned here at UD. Okay, so that means my guys should always have a job on a research project in the social sciences, because I'm gonna train them really well. And I know my faculty, my colleagues, want that really precious exotic data. That became the bargaining chip, right? My guys are gonna go into some of the diciest community places to get your data in the most organized ways possible. Ain't nobody gonna work harder than them. Yes, hire your doc students, but these guys are going to go to the projects for you at night at 11 o'clock. That means, right? So now the university became a source or a site or a place where I can always get them work. And quality work, right? And you got to pay them a doctoral student rate. And they started doing that, right? $20, $25 an hour, right? Depending on the grant. Now, once we started doing that, right? So now to answer your question more directly, the challenge, right? University of Delaware background check office comes into place for the first time because of the Wilmington Street PAR program. Right, the fact that the newspaper started writing about how all these guys started getting jobs working on all these research projects, right? How this was a wonderful thing. This was front page news. You know, our flagship newspaper, News Journal, was applauding this. People in the community was applauding this idea, right? And then I got the phone call from various folk in administration. They wanted a meeting yesterday, right? And they started letting guys go. One guy sued and won. I can't talk about the case beyond that, because you can't just start firing people, right? And then they instituted a, and mind you, graduate students and faculty were formally petitioning against this, right? Because the guys so much love, right? And they're really working hard. They show up on time, etc. Right? So I would say institutional kinds of bureaucracy, the academy, we found a balance. My guys still are here, not in the same capacity. Things are different, but we did find a balance, in that story. But in any event, I would say my greatest challenge has been, mind you, I was recruited here to do PAR, to help University of Delaware's image, right, in the community, because the community began getting upset with all the grants that we get and how we exploit the community, right? And I was told this, right? With the things I was doing in New York, we need you to bring that model down here, right? And then things began to really fall into place. The Perfect 15 was the first, right? And we began working with city and state leadership out the gate. University of Delaware helped broker it. Over time, right, administration changed. The deans changed, the provost changed. They were funding the projects, matching my grants for 100% too. Paid for my documentary, everything. This is the provost, right? Then all of them transitioned out for one reason or the other. And now we have a very conservative administration. Right. In any event, and I'll end with this, a lot of the background check offices in Delaware, right, particularly at Wilmington University, University of Delaware, Del Tech Community College, right? These are places that I send my folk to. They've all developed background offices because of my guys. Started going back to college, and folks started wanting, and through them, other folk from the community wanted to go back to college, and we began promoting that, right? And so literally during our they instituted, all of these institutions, their first background check policies. That's the biggest challenge.
Yeah. I like to speak to as a person not coming from academia to the community, but coming from the community to academia via PAR. So a lot of the challenges I can't relate to with the other scholars because I'm not coming from academia down to the community. And that presents a challenge for all of us, is that we need more PAR, we need more people that are coming from the community, maybe going back to school, earning terminal degrees, becoming change agents, being motivated to make change, so that change is more likely to happen just by the math. And it's a good thing. So when I listen, I'm like, wow, any of those issues when I go in. So there needs to be more people like me, people that willing and able to go back to school, get more education, and come back and give back. And there's so many people like me. I just wanted to bring that up. There's so many people. When I met Dr. Payne, I graduated from undergrad. I was substitute teaching and cutting hair. And I've responded to this. Another community person gave me a flyer and said, hey, this would be good for you. And look at me now, 10 years later. So I think that needs to happen times 1,000,000 in every community in the United States, because we generally, I can testify that I don't have those issues when I go to Southwest Philadelphia, when I'm in the 51st Ward, when I'm doing things in my community. So there needs to be more PAR taking place, more people. It's like a human capital theory. You got to make these investments in your community. I think that PAR is a way to make capital, the grants and things. It's a way to make capital investments in your community, in your workforce. So you don't have a regular workforce later. I think we need more PAR. That's a challenge.
Thank you. That is incredibly insightful. So I guess my next question is, to the folks listening who may not be sold on PAR or who are scared away from the challenges that y'all discussed, would you encourage others to engage in this type of research? Why or why not?
Well, I will say yes and no, and the reason for that is because I think my role in being on this and doing it is just to encourage people to try it. But it's not for everybody. There is a lot of things that you have to commit to. There's time, there's trust, there's building. You have to build this over time. And if you're passionate about it, then you will give it all your heart, and this is what you dream to do every day. But I also deeply respect people that said, I don't want to mess with that, because that's messy. I don't want to go and be with the community and be there, because everything that happens in the community should be on their time. It should be based on their needs and their strengths, and this is about working with them. It's not about us colonizing, imposing our perspectives or our views, or using them in a way that will favor our careers. That's not what PAR is about. So I have had students that have gone with me and they just fell in love and this is what they want to do, to the point that they're pursuing a PhD and they don't want to be in academia at all. They just want to be in community, which is great. I feel happy that they found their niche. But I have had students that after the second meeting in the community, they're like, no way, I'm not going back. So, I will definitely encourage people to get out of your comfort zone, try it, give it a try, but give it a meaningful try. Just don't go one time and say, check a box, I volunteer, put it in your CV. Just, if you're going to do it with your heart, give it your soul in what you're doing. And if it is not for you, you tried it. And then you can, honestly say, this was not for me. But you may find a new passion. You may find that this is something that you have no idea that is in you. So again, yes and no.
I think every research project should be PAR-based, honestly. I mean, to me, PAR is a set of principles that we aspire to live by and always fall short of. But the point is that you do the best with what you can. And I think some people have more resources and more time and more knowledge about how PAR works, et cetera. And they can have a project that might be considered PAR. And I think there are lots of people who don't have the time, maybe don't have quite as many people skills, but there are always ways. In every single project, I am 100% convinced that there are ways to make your project more participatory, more inclusive, better able to address the needs of the community that that your research is about, or some kind of social inequality. And so every student I work with, it's a requirement that they do PAR in some way. And then I work with them to figure out, what does that look like for your project? And I think the next stage in PAR is to figure out, how do we make this more accessible for people? How do, I do think it's a principle, and then you have to innovate. I mean, every PAR project is radically different from every other one. There's no like, check these boxes, and I really think that, just like, we had a revolution in sort of critical scholarship becoming really central in many social science disciplines. I think PAR is the next wave. I think we're getting there. There are more people who publicly profess to do PAR. There are more trainings and panels, and I think the word is going to get out there more.
I think PAR is hard, right? So, and it's hard to get a frame of reference for it to do it well. And most institutions don't want to see really large, viable PAR or translational programs. That is inherently threatening. So I've actually heard that message, right? Just the idea, right, of organizing a research program to address capitalism, right, is essentially what's going on, particularly with the more aggressive PAR programs. Whether the PAR programs are aware of that or not, you're challenging power in such an abrasive way, right, that it becomes a deal breaker for some institutes, and or at least that's how they let's see it. I think the best first step is to get experience on a PAR project, right? I always say that to folks, right? So becoming a research assistant, starting at the bottom, right, on a research, and now that is under the assumption that it's a well-resourced large PAR project, right? And we run these large PAR projects where we're collecting, hundreds of surveys, right? And conducting these interviews, and we have these big data sets. So there's grant money, and there's lots of things to do. Everyone doesn't have to lead a PAR project. PAR projects come in different shapes and sizes, right? I don't think everyone needs to do PAR. I don't. I also think a lot of PAR researchers, and I say this respectfully, it's nobody here, but I do feel this in general. A lot of PAR researchers are bad researchers. They have bad methodological and empirical skill sets. I do believe in doing lots and lots of action, right? And we do lots and lots of action.
Tons.
We really do, right? And we also do publish. I really believe in publishing, right? And not shortchanging that. Not publishing, though, for the reasons of the academy, because you want to get tenure. I think that's important. Got to get tenure, got to keep the job, right? But we're publishing as a way to fight back, right? We create our own theories, our own ways of doing things, and we have our own arguments, right? And I do think I would be shortchanging folk if we did not publish, and we want to publish in those journals, We want to write in other non-traditional trade platforms. We want to do that too. We do op-eds. We do all across the board. You know, we're working on a PAR project now. I mean, it's a book project now, right? And there are 3 authors, one of which is a PAR member from the project, right? And we're on an academic press, right? So what I'm saying is, for PAR to be taken seriously, we have to roll up our sleeves and do high quality empirical work too, quant and qual, right? One of my guys, first author, just came out with a publication, not to brag, but I think back in December, November, right? All regressions. And Dr. Wilson, that's Wolfie, right? Wolfie had one of the biggest and baddest, and you know, whatever out here.
That's right.
All regressions, right? And really making a compelling argument around policing from the perspective of the streets. That's what makes it powerful, right? Now we're not grabbing on necessarily to mainstream idea. No, we're here to make an argument on behalf. We're here to fight, but with data, right? So I would say that is a humongous responsibility. Most folk, when they're thinking about PAR, they aren't thinking about it in that way. I don't think that's the way we do PAR, right? That means you got to be all in for good or for bad, right? And from that perspective, participation in the more formal aspects of research, right? That we're trying to seize the opportunity. I want to see my guys at ASC. I do. I really do. I really do, right? You know, but again, it's a socio-political project, and we need to establish ourselves in ways that help us to fight from within and also from without. But we got to control our own knowledge.
I would encourage people to and researchers to be involved in PAR, especially when you're dealing with marginalized societies, populations rather, and also people who need help, people who have been victimized over time, be it peace studies or whatever, because these are the people that can benefit most from the research. I, like myself, for example, we're doing from small, like Dr. Payne said, from large to small scale studies. I'm doing a small community 10-block radius needs assessment, but I'm going to need the community to go out and get those surveys filled out, and they're learning at the same time. So the model in itself is always going to be a continuous source of benefit and advantage, because you have the community involved in every part of the research process. So I'd encourage it.
Awesome. So my final question for me is, what does the future hold for PAR?
It's going to grow. It's going to get bigger. It's going to take over the world.
I think so. I actually think so. I get emails.
It's growing. Yeah.
I get emails from all around the world for the work that we're doing in Wilmington. You know, I have a doctoral student, you know, he just graduated actually over there in Germany, right, who wants to create, and then I had some doctoral students from London, and they wanted to create street PAR Europe, right? I think that's a continent, you know, there's lots of countries. But right. You know, I get it from Jamaica, from Canada, lots of PAR work in Canada. You know, so what I see is lots of young people, young scholars, definitely community activists, but young scholars, young graduate students. I get lots of emails from them, and young faculty members. I think at some point after that, the Academy works really hard to kind of extinguish that drive and motivation. Now, I think the romantic period for PAR is actually between 1995 and 2005, right? And then the Academy worked really hard. It became increasingly conservative. And it has responded in ways which has kind of suppressed some of the organizing energy around all kinds of methodologies, but up to and including PAR. So I think, you know, I think there's a lot of energy there. I think as long as we keep the lights on, as long as we continue to publish, as long as we continue to swim, swing, run, as long as we just keep it viable, at some point it's going to be entrenched. You know, that at least that's how I look at it. I think there is an assault on community research engagement, I think, in figuring that out and reining that in the Academy. Right now, though, I think the energy around it is so popular that administrations across institutions, they're just taking a step back. They won't, you know, for political correct reasons, they're not going to put the kibosh on it at this point. But I think all this talk around translational PAR, I think it is making the academy nervous. And they're trying to figure it out. Critical race theory, I think that's definitely making the academy nervous. But as long as we just keep at it, everyone just do what they can where they're at, you know, it will slowly, it's growing, and it will continue to slowly grow, and we will reach a critical mass. Before you know, it wouldn't matter anyway, where it's too many of us here, and we, you know, and our flag is planted. So that's how I kind of think about it.
And I think, you know, it's definitely growing, and this is a great time to be able to do this and to do it and to advance the field in many different applications. And for many of us that have been doing this for a long time, this is the greatest time for us, because now finally people are seeing the significance of this. So I see this growing in a more transformative way in our societies. I think this is an opportunity to elevate voices, as an opportunity to also speak up about the strengths of our communities. You know, we come from a deficit approach that has been used in academia forever. And then we're learning that communities have had forever ways to resolve their own problems, to thrive, to do their own thing. And we have always looking at them with this negative lens. So being able to talk about strengths, being able to give back to these communities and give them the place that they deserve, you know, being able to transform is a social responsibility. We are active participants in social change. So again, you know, I'm extremely happy that this is happening right now. We are in a great time to be able to mobilize this. And I appreciate, you know, also the fact that we are becoming more rigorous. And we have always been very rigorous, but for some people have been just that thing that you do on the side. You know, it's not something that had a place and a name, and it is being recognized. So, you know, I think that this is a great time for us to be developing this further, and it's up to us to educate the public about the importance of doing this and working together on advancing PAR in many different levels, not just in academia, because, you know, we need to think about also the non-academic context that this could actually make a big difference.
I agree with everything that was said. I'll just add that, you know, there's only so many new ideas that the same people can like come up with, right? And there's this like tiny little academic bubble of people with PhDs who are in tenured positions. And at some point, and I think already many years ago, we ran out of new things to say. You know, we keep reproducing ideas, and I'm the first one to do this, and 100,000 people have said the same thing. And I think that our own disciplines will start to realize that if we want to actually have new understandings of the things we study, we have to go outside of this bubble. You know, the canon is holding us back because it tells us how to think. And people who've not been, you know, indoctrinated with the canon, by definition, do not see the world that way. And that is where new ideas, new knowledge, and new possibilities for imagining the future, imagining social theories, right, making sense of the world are going to come from. And so if we can just get over these epistemological hierarchies that we've been so conditioned to hold, I think that people will start to embrace the incredible benefits that we as scholars, as, you know, all types of scholars will derive from welcoming more people to the table.
Incredible. I thank you guys for your transparency throughout this session, and thank you for being really open and willing to discuss, you know, a lot of the hurdles that you faced. We're going to open it up now for the Q&A. I am a union worker, so we've been following the stack method for the last year or so, doing Zoom. If y'all would like to drop a stack in the chat and I can call on you, I will nudge you gently if you are, you know, going over 2 minutes with your, this is a comment, not a question sort of thing. But otherwise it's open. Let us know what your questions are.
Maybe explain to people who don't know what stack is, what that means.
Very true. You just say stack and it kind of like lines you up, and I call on you by the stack number.
So just write the word stack.
Yes. So just drop stack in the box if you want to ask a question.
Thank you all so much for this. This was really great. I think I'm a couple years out of doing social science research and coming back to it, and I did not realize, I thought I knew what PAR was and I did not. And so I think I'm a believer at this point after this. Dr. Payne, I think you mentioned some, what you called radical versions of PAR outside the US and outside the West. I'm wondering what examples Dr. Payne and the rest of the panel also you all have of kind of what you would call radical examples of PAR.
Yeah, make sure to read a piece before, there's a bunch of examples come to mind, but make sure you read a piece by Gavin Mueller. I forget the name of the essay. I teach it in my street ethnography class here at UD, but Gavin Mueller, who talks about radical street ethnography or radical ethnography, and he does have some discussions on PAR in that essay. But in terms of what it means, I think it's a great essay in terms of just what that actually means. But in terms of the most radical forms of PAR, you have different iterations, right? But particularly, I think Central and South America, I think Ignacia Martin Baró, Dr. Martin Baró, who actually has a PhD in social psychology. He actually creates liberation psychology, which is a very aggressive PAR iteration, right? His most famous book, it's actually a posthumous release, comes out in '94, which is called Liberation Psychology. He has his PhD in social psychology at University of Chicago. He returns back to his home, I think in El Salvador, where, you know, and the PAR researchers in Central and South America were so radical, they began to assassinate them. So he's assassinated in 1989. Right, and beautiful writer, great ideas, right, serious organizer through and scholarship, but also outside of scholarship as well. I would say the most aggressive PAR project that we know to date, probably arguably, right, don't like to compare necessarily, contrast these projects, but arguably is Fidel Castro and Ernesto Rivera's Literacy Brigade project. Just Google Literacy Brigade. I think 1959-ish is when it starts. It's right before really the revolution, but then it gets full flush after revolution, to be honest with you. Go from 50% literacy rate to nearly 100% literacy rate, where it's maintained at today, right? And we know their form of action, right, which was the military, and they took their country back. But one of the most aggressive PAR projects in history, right? Keep in mind, PAR is very, very infectious inside communities, right? I would say another example, definitely saying with if we go over, I think, to Brazil, classic example, but radical for his time and day. Paulo Freire, he was actually jailed, exiled, nearly assassinated, right, for organizing people around literacy campaign. And that was kind of how they did it back in Central and South America. A lot of their PAR projects weren't the kind of PAR that we do, or the kind of PAR that we do here in the States. It was really teaching people to read a lot of their own stuff, right, but to improve literacy so that they can engage in more effective organizing. But those are just a few examples. They're more a liberation theology. There are all kinds of examples down in Central and South America where you have, right, radical PAR, where again, they began assassinating the PAR researchers because they were just that radical. Ignacio Martin Baró modeled his liberation psychology after the Literacy Brigade in Cuba. So that's why they felt he had to go.
So the next question comes from Henrika, and her question is, what advice would you give to students interested in pursuing PAR for their dissertation?
Start early. It's going to take a long time.
Start early.
Start early. So if you have this interest, that's something that I talk with my students like the first semester, and I always tell them, I don't want to overwhelm you, but if this is an interest that you have, and I look at show them the projects that I'm doing and brainstorm with them and say, well, let's start brainstorming, let's start working, let's start digging a little bit. And if you're interested in this, I want you to start coming to some of these programs. Let's get hands-on on this. And then, because you don't want to wait until last year, you're not going to make it. You need to really start early, building this over time.
I would just add to that, go read about some models of PAR. Dr. Payne just listed a few. There are many, many others, and find a mentor. I'll just throw it out there. I don't have a graduate program in my department, but I would love to work with graduate students who want to do PAR. I'm just such a believer in this. And I think that one of the current challenges is how few people of the current generation of established faculty do PAR. And so there are very, very few people out there to train the next generation. However, I have met so many grad and undergrad students who are super excited about PAR. And so, you know, your mentors don't have to be at your institution. Look broadly, read about the research that other faculty are doing in terms of PAR and reach out to them. And my guess is, unless they're incredibly overwhelmed, that they will want to find some way to help you. And I'll just put a plug. I'm actually teaching a course on PAR this summer for free. And I'd be happy to send folks the link for that.
Jonna, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Yes, thank you all so much. This has been amazing. So since by definition, PAR requires you to build very close relationships and intimacy with the people you're working with, have any of you had examples of situations where you kind of had to deal with boundaries around that connection and intimacy, either, you know, to protect yourself or to protect the people you're working with? And how did you handle those situations? And what would you advise about, you know, kind of navigating those lines of, you know, appropriate relationships?
So I think great mentorship is really important, right? Dr. Fallberg just mentioned, but great mentorship, right? I don't think anyone should launch a major PAR project right out. I think, you know, again, PAR comes in different shapes and sizes. Yes, you will have to deal with, you know, developing rapport, you know, developing trust, boundary issues. All of that is possible, right? But I think, right, the more confident, and I only with experience and time, but the more confident, the more competent, right? But the more confident, stronger, right, the PAR researcher is, right, the easier will be to navigate and stand firm with regard to certain relationships. I will say for me, the biggest issue, and I guess this is a boundary issue, but in a different way. I work with guys from the streets. I use street PAR as a way to do street ethnography, right? And we're studying all kinds of hard issues, up to and including gun violence, right? And something you learn, and I would encourage, take a good street ethnography class or a good ethnography class, right? So one of the things that I learned, I had to really learn doing this PAR thing, is self-care, right? And a lot of my guys are one step out of the streets, you know, and, you know, so across space and time, a number of guys, you know, have been harmed or hurt, or we've lost some folk. And right, and you develop this bond, you know, with folk, and you really get really close. And then when something happens, right, and then you get that phone call at 11 at night or midnight or whenever, and you're in the hospital and you're visiting people, you know, over time, particularly, right, so we have a PAR program, 1 project, 2 project, 3 project, 4, everything grows off of each other exponentially, right? But also sometimes the pain and the sadness can concentrate, right, in ways. So one thing I had to learn, and I underestimated as it relates, I guess, to boundaries, is dealing with a lot of the emotional turmoil that will come with just being close with another person, and particularly the guys that I'm close with, right? You know, so just dealing with that and try not to absorb it in such a way where it throws you off of, you know, throws you out of whack. So.
That's a great question. And I would like to add to that. Honesty is incredibly important. You need to show them that you are a real person. You know, you are not a savior. You are there to work with them, to listen to them. And I have often tell them, you know, because sometimes people want you to solve the problems. They perceive you as having more resources or being in a different position. And I always tell them, you know, I will spend all the time that you want to spend with me, but I want you to be able to represent yourself, to speak for yourself. I can connect you with services, but I'm not going to take you there. I'm not going to drive you there. I'm not going to make you do it. You really need to commit from your side. So that honesty is important. You know, I also like them to see me as a person with flaws. with issues as well. Somebody that needs time out, someone that also has a family, has a separate life, someone that is committed to them, but not at the expense of taking away time from my family at certain times, So that is important in establishing those boundaries. But that's an incredibly important question, because out of passion, we're so committed to this that we may be sending the wrong message. So we really need to be able to have these clear boundaries, which are healthy in the long term. And then they know, they also are healthy for them to be able to speak for themselves and to get on their own feet and walk their walk instead of having us to be there to rescue them all the time.
My motto is only promise what I can deliver and never overpromise. And so I will often start very small with like, why don't we just have a casual conversation and imagine what could be, and then you build on it. Okay, I'm going to look for some funding. I can't make any promises, and I just keep people fully informed. Like, these are my constraints. I have to do these things. These are the bureaucracies within which I'm working. I'm only one person. And this is what the project can be. I wish it could be all these other things. I just can't do that, but I'll support you if you want to do it. So I've just been extremely clear, but I've had to learn over time how to not try to fix everything. And that's not my role there anyway, right? And so, but I mean, I can give you so many examples of, some of the challenges that I have is I often will try to pay people. I mean, I always pay people for whatever work they do. But sometimes because of institutional deadlines, you need the work done like this. And then there all of a sudden is a gunfight and people are traumatized, and then there's no internet for like a week. And then, their computer breaks and they can't get the work done, or they're in a state of depression, they can't get the work done. And then what, right? So then I end up doing the work. It becomes very, very messy. And so the best thing that I've learned is like, I just only promise what I know I can deliver. And exactly like Dr. Trejos Castillo just said, I'm human too. I'm going to mess up. I'm going to do my best. I care, but I'm imperfect. And I think people, as they get to know you, will come to see you as a friend and as a colleague. And in my case, as a member of my host family. And people know, even if I mess up, that it was, I didn't mean it, and I'm going to do the best I can to fix it now.
I want to give you guys some space to offer any concluding thoughts, anything that the questions didn't cover that you think is important to communicate today. Please, now is the time to do so, since staff is empty. So floor is all yours.
I really want to thank you and the organizers of this panel for giving us the opportunity. And I want to make an open invitation to people to continue this conversation. This dialogue is extremely important. And there's many of us that are interested in collaborating, working together. So like Dr. Fowler was saying before, you don't need to limit yourself to your own university. I work with people all over the world, actually, and even in the States as well. So reach out. We would love to participate, to work with you, to brainstorm with you, to share what we have learned, our own mistakes, our own experiences, give you ideas. And if you want us to participate, in my case, you wanted to be part of your dissertation or your thesis, or just talk about it, feel free to reach out. I think that our strength is in the numbers. We're doing great things. And sometimes, the greatest conversations that I have had have been, for example, with the students, community leaders, people that have amazing ideas that they are so shy to share. And then we start talking, and it's like, oh my God, that's an amazing idea. Why don't you do this and do that? And then at the end, they ended up with beautiful projects. So reach out, don't be shy. We are a resource for you.
I actually thought most research projects were PAR oriented, right? I didn't have that language at the time as a doc student, but I actually thought more research was done from this perspective. And I was really surprised when I realized how exploitive the research enterprise actually was, right? So with that said, I think, I've learned a lot. I learned a lot about the politics of research and what it means to move it, and right? But I think at the end of the day, one thing that's important to know, and we need to share with each other, particularly as PAR researchers, right, is how power is organized at the academy. And everything really, and a lot of the R1 institutions and or its aspirations and motivations are determined by the Board of Trustees, right? And the administration didn't follow those until. So I'm only saying all of that to say, because these are the kinds of granular conversations that we had to start having, like, to really understand the culture of the institution, right? They set the agenda, right? They, in many respects, and they set the agenda in terms of what kind of research, right, will be valued, right? PAR in of itself can be seen as threatening, right? Given how it mobilizes, or how, at least right? So keep in mind, you can get millions of dollars in grant funding, right? Particularly if it's CBPR, or just simply participatory research, or research minus the action, right? Lots of NIH dollars set aside for that, in fact, right? And public health, scores of multi-million-dollar participatory research grants in that field in particular, right? But no action, and they just really organizing folks in the community to help them collect the data, right? But in any event, I think it's important for PAR programs to understand the culture of the academy, to understand where power lies at in the academy. I think it's important for PAR research programs, right, to understand the agendas that are being, and then using that information to inform your PAR program, right? So that you can just minimize the naivete or the false consciousness as much as possible, right? That's the message that I would leave you with. Understand how power is being organized and how it's set up in such a way to destabilize, right, a PAR program. Again, not to shut you down, right, but to inform you in terms of where all the traps may be at. Become much more aware of what's going on in the academy around just doing community-based research can help.
I'll just second. I mean, I'm so grateful for this invitation, for this community. I think that having these types of conversations, bringing PAR scholars together and people who are interested in this is a critical step in moving this forward. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of the other panelists. It's been wonderful to learn from all of you. I need a mentor too, so you'll be hearing from me. I mean, I want to echo what Dr. Payne and others have said about it is important to know the politics. And I also want to just appreciate how difficult it is to be, particularly a PhD student right now, because there are already so few opportunities for getting into academia. And I think having a mentor help you find the balance of doing what your community really needs, and then also what you need to be able to move into, the positions where you want to be, is a very fine balance and is very tricky, and it comes with no easy answers. And so try to build yourself a community of people who care about this, people who will support you, because most people around you will not. And people who will help give you some suggestions.
Yes, nothing more important than a support network, support base. That's, yes, most valuable piece of information. A small clique of PAR researchers that you can trust.
I'd like to say thank you for having me, give me this opportunity to be able to have this conversation and contribute to the conversation. If I could leave you with anything, it would be that communities of color need PAR. And I'm an advocate, really big advocate for that. We need it, we need more of it. I encourage it.
Thank you all so much. I've been looking forward to this panel for days and days, and completely exceeded any expectations I had. You will probably be hearing from me. So thank you for your transparency through this process, for the knowledge that you have shared. I appreciate it so very much. Folks, a lot of them have dropped their contact information. The panelists have dropped their contact information in the chat. Do utilize it, do rely on it. Again, thank you. I appreciate you so very much for taking the time to do this.